Hi, and welcome to Across the Canon. Today we are joined by Dr. Paul Sloan, who earned his PhD at the University of St. Andrews and is Associate Professor of Early Christianity at Houston Christian University. He's also the author of Mark 13 and The Return of the Shepherd, and this book, Jesus and the Law of Moses, the Gospels and the Restoration of Israel within First-Century Judaism. Dr. Sloan, thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. I've enjoyed this book. This is I think one of my takeaways is just a reminder of how little at times I really do understand the complexities of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you do a good job of bringing out a lot of things that, I just sort of take for granted. I think you mentioned this in the book that a lot of us in the West sort of just give this overview of the Old Testament, and we don't really dive deep in there because it's not a context culturally that we live in. We're not surrounded by Torah laws and things like that. And so I really appreciated that. I appreciated the way that you tie this together, moving forward into the gospel and how Jesus would be interpreting that. And I've just really enjoyed this book. So I'm excited to talk to you about it.
I appreciate it. Yeah, the stuff that is kind of the burden of much of it is it's kind of both trying to just make plain some of the aspects of the Old Testament that seem quite esoteric to us, particularly stuff from Leviticus and ritual purity and stuff like that. And then, of course, obviously trying to make it work in the Gospels or show how it's employed in the Gospels. But even if I'm wrong about that, I've hoped there's at least a service with respect to just making plain some of the Old Testament stuff for a lot of readers.
Absolutely. And so tell us a little bit about yourself, right? You are a scholar of scripture. So how did that path work out for you? How did you end up where you are?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wanted to be a pastor growing up, and so sort of going the route of biblical studies just seemed the obvious route. So I did. So I started. I did some master's work and then did the PhD. And then while I was doing that, I just kind of realized I really like doing this sort of on its own. I still had sort of an ear to the ground, as it were, in a lot of respects, and always had. But even after I got my PhD and then got the post at HCU, where I've been since 2016. I just a couple years ago I became the teaching pastor of a church. So I'm the teaching pastor of a church called Heights Church here in Houston, and so it is finally sort of wed in that sense, my love of biblical studies and preaching. But in terms of, so that's sort of the avenue into it. Once I was in it in biblical studies, that is, um, I I kind of gravitated toward the very kind of basic questions about continuity, because that just seems such a beating heart and a lot of questions that readers have when they come to the text, because I think fueled by an understandable question about sort of, are the purposes of God the same?
Mhm.
Are these the same person, and are his purposes the same? And because that, I think that speaks to us about sort of the comprehensibility of it. And so those kinds of questions always attracted me, which once you begin to ask questions about continuity and God's purposes, sort of like not very many hops in that hopscotch game, you're going to arrive at the question of the law. And so I did that pretty quickly in my PhD. I ended up not doing my PhD on that at all. But then I came back to it as soon as I could after I finished it. So I've kind of been jumping back and forth between research and writing on Paul and these questions, and of course Jesus and these questions. So that's how I ended up here. And I mentioned him in the acknowledgments. But Chris Kugler was a colleague at HCU, and he was just basically, probably just getting bombarded by these, my sort of almost like being harangued by me, just showing up to his office with a question or a comment or an insight that I felt I had. And finally he was like, dude, would you please just write the book? Would you please just write this book? Stop bothering me about it, No, he was never bothered, but so he actually kind of nudged me along that direction. So if you, I mentioned this in another interview, but if you really liked or hated this book, you can either thank or blame Chris Kugler for that.
Just
Ultimately.
send your hate mail that direction.
Yeah, that's right.
That's awesome. And so, with the book itself, right? We're talking Jesus and the Law of Moses, and very early in the book, you start off with a quote from Matthew 19:17, right? And so it's someone came to him and said, "Teacher, what good thing shall I do so that I may obtain eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why are you asking me about what is good? There's only one who is good. But if you want to enter life, keep the commandments." And so, that's sort of the opening volley, so to speak, scripturally, that you're working off of there. So, like, what is it you're seeing in that text, and why is that a good launching point for where this book is going?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Why start there? One, actually, I wanted to start with exegesis, because I did that pretty consistently across the chapters. I don't think I did it with every chapter, but I wanted pretty consistently to begin with an interpretation of a biblical text, just to kind of sort of set the standard, as it were. The and the reason, of course, then that I chose that text, it maybe probably because it's sort of an obvious one, with respect to when you're talking about Jesus and the law, that when someone comes up to Jesus and says, how to enter eternal life? And his response is just kind of straightforwardly, instinctively, even it seems, keep the commandments. Um, it his response is related to very clearly the law of Moses, and it strikes me that you can answer that question, or sorry, rather, you can interpret that passage with lots of different frameworks or assumptions that reveal lots of different other presuppositions that you have that are probably going to inform how you take the other law passages. So the passage, the interpretation of that passage that I'd come across quite often, both in sort of homiletical context, preaching context, but also I'd seen it in some commentaries. I think it's Calvin's interpretation. Is that he gives this standard, keep the commandments, but sort of parenthetically, it's an impossible standard,
Right.
and it's given to show you that you can't keep it, so that you instead rely on grace and faith, etc. And then a lot of people, of course, go straight to Romans 3 for that. Now, I think what I'd really really want listeners to be clear about, in terms of my own interpretation, is that, of course, I think sort of grace and faith are necessary both in the Messiah himself, and that those are not sort of conjunctive with, in Matthew 19, not sort of disjunctive with the law. My point is to say that the whole notion that he's giving an impossible standard,
Mhm.
that then he expects to be relieved by something else, it's very odd in the passage itself. The passage doesn't state that. Like, you have to then rely on something like Romans 3 for that, even though actually I think Romans 3 can be better coordinated with my reading of Matthew 19 than alternatives. That's probably that may be a different conversation. But the point is that, like, Jesus doesn't tell the guy that, right? Like, the guy, right? Like, if that's your reading, then all of a sudden you have Jesus sort of like leaving this guy out on a limb, right? He asks the answer. He asks this important question. Jesus answers, keep the commandments. And the guy's like, well, I've done that. Well, that'd been the perfect opportunity, right, for him to be like, no, you haven't. You need, something else. And he doesn't. He does, of course, add. He does say, well, one thing you lack.
Yeah.
But that's my point, is that to say one thing you lack, it means that, okay, yeah, I'm taking for granted your keeping of the commandments. And then I'm not sort of negating that answer now, but there's something you need to add on to that, which is following me. That just reveals to me that the Gospels are presenting following Jesus and keeping Torah as not disjunctive things, but as things that actually complement each other quite well.
And I think that in and of itself would be kind of a shocking statement to some to hear, right?
Okay.
The idea,
No. Then you need to read this book. Yeah.
right? The idea that Jesus would be in line with the Torah and want to be in line with the Torah.
Mm,
I think there are some corners that would really
sure.
not like that answer.
Sure.
And fair enough. This is why we have to write books and get into
Yeah.
these things. So, I think the interpretation that you offered there is a fairly common interpretation that I know that I have certainly heard, right? That Jesus
Mhm.
gives this
Yep.
standard, and that the law, this idea that the law exists solely as a standard to show human insufficiency, such
Mhm.
that grace, can come in. But you give, I think, a really good quote on page 14, discussing Israel's relationship to the law, in a way that, well, I'll just read what you said,
Sure.
because
That's
I
fine.
think it's good. It says, the depiction, therefore, of Israel living under the law is not that of a people bearing an intolerable burden by which they struggle to earn their salvation, or a burden causing despair of ever finding a gracious God. On the contrary, the law assured them of God's desire to dwell with them, revealed to them God's requirements, and declared to them the divinely prescribed means through which they could regularly commune with God and experience his forgiveness and grace. And I remember the first time I was introduced to that kind of idea, and I was in seminary at the time. I was like, wait a minute. Like, this
Sounds
kind
like
of
a really
sounds
good
like the law
deal.
is good.
Sounds like a great deal. I'd sign up for that.
So,
Yeah.
talk to us a little bit about that. Like, what's going on there? Have you always believed that? Was there a paradigm shift for you, and how did that occur?
I'm sure I didn't always believe it. No, I couldn't have come out of the womb with that one. And I don't even think I had a 14-year-old self view of that. I couldn't quite pinpoint when that became sort of more concretized. I suspect it was probably in my master's days when I was probably first introduced to it uh, through Tom Wright's New Testament, the People of God, but
Mhm.
he was referring to Sanders,
Yeah.
right? So sort of Sanders being the watershed moment, E.P. Sanders, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, where he describes sort of the Judaism of the Second Temple period that way as covenantal nomism, but the way in which the covenant was maintained by obedience, but also repentance and the sacrificial system that are so just basic to the understanding of what Israel needs in the presence of their God. They didn't assume that they were sinlessly perfect. The other thing was I just thought once that sort of when Sanders said it, okay, I thought, okay, yeah, that's at the time when I was hearing that, I was like, oh gosh, yeah, that's really shaking the boat, right, right, because if people all think that Judaism is legalistic, and so instead
Mhm.
here you hear Sanders coming along, right. The funny thing is that Sanders is describing his view. And read the title of his book, right? Paul and Palestinian Judaism. So he's describing the Judaism of sort of Second Temple Judaism and some early rabbinic literature. Like he's not really trying to describe what other readers might call just sort of like the Old Testament view, right?
Mhm.
In the sense of like, all right, well, here's how the system worked in just in the Bible, in sort of quote the Old Testament, right? He's trying to show it in how it's received in this late Second Temple Jewish early rabbinic material, and I think he's on the whole, accurate about that. With some parts where in fact, a really important part where I would disagree with him, actually, as it comes to sacrifice, which we may talk about later.
Mhm.
But I think once I had that sort of the Sanders view of sort of Judaism in my head in the get go, and then just kind of went back and was reading the Bible, I was like, yeah, it's just like God's like it's right on it's on the surface of the page, right? Like God's like, I know you guys are rebellious. I know you guys are stubborn hearted. I know, right? I know, like he already knows Israel is a certain way. The hard heartedness, rebelliousness, whatever, the sinful characterization of Israel itself is just basic to humankind, and he's not like surprised by their sin, right? And it's not they that initiate the sacrificial system; it's God. That's sort of like when I was like starting to just really think through the logic of like it's God who's like I'm gonna dwell with you guys,
Yeah.
Um, that I thought like okay, this is just it's God's intention to be with His people. It's God's intention to maintain this, and then Leviticus 17 verse 10 and 11, which I probably again, I probably came to this by way of the work of David Moffat, who then was talking about Jacob Milgram's work on Leviticus, who then made me really think hard about Leviticus 17. But that line, right, like, do not eat blood, so that Yahweh tells his people not to eat blood. He says, because I have given it to you, so that you can make atonement for yourselves on the altars, etc. I thought, that's it. I mean, Milgram makes this point. It's reversing all the language, right? All the language up to this point is, now when you bring this, give it to the altar. You're giving it to Yahweh, yada yada. But then you've got this one sort of foundational text in Leviticus 17, 10, 11, where it sort of all of a sudden, this whole time, right, Israel's been giving the sacrifices to God, but then all of a sudden it's revealed that, but every time you do it, you're actually just giving to me what I've given to you. And so it presents the sacrifices, which are things that we give to God, as ultimately God's gift to us so that we can have something to give. And that just like that verse could do so much for a person's theology, right? And the reading of the Bible, right? And that when we're obeying God, we're actually just walking into the steps of the things he's given us, right? It's actually funny. I hadn't thought about that. I haven't paired that with sort of the good works that he's prepared for you to walk in. But it just seems like that's actually just endemic to Leviticus 17, the sacrifices, right? You're just giving the gifts that he's given you to give. And so that just put me on a different track, thinking about this stuff. So then once I had that roadblock out of the way, like and it is a roadblock. If you already assume that Judaism legalistic, then you got these other issues, and to me, that's a real roadblock to being able to then understand the kinds of actual inner dialogue or conversation that Jesus is having with the contemporaries about the law, or just sort of about really any of the discourse about the law, particularly in the Gospels. I mean, obviously the New Testament broadly, but I think particularly in the Gospels. And so it opened up a different set of questions that I could even begin to ask.
Sure, because I mean, if you're coming into it with law equals bad, and then Jesus is pointing to areas like that, go keep the commandments, you then have to find some framework to reinterpret Jesus in a way that's in line with your presupposition about this negative view of the law.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. Yeah, if you've already got, keeping the commandments is this impossible standard, or this sort of even the attempt to do it is itself disobedience, right?
Yeah.
Which is popular in some circles. Well, then, if you've got Jesus saying, keep the commandments, right? I mean, I'll put it, this is not academic, so forgive me. This is supposed to be an academic a podcast, but I mean, this one was burned into me. So
yeah,
I was at this was before my PhD. This is 12, 15 years ago, whatever it was. I was in a Bible study, and this guy, he asked me, he goes, the biggest question I've always had is Matthew 19. I was like, oh yeah, what about it? And he brought up this person's comment, hey, how do I get eternal life? And his question was, gosh, isn't it so odd? Jesus, the master evangelist, he has a guy right in his hands. He didn't have to go to this guy, like the master evangelist. This guy came up to him and asked him. And Jesus lied to him. He said, why? But his question was, why do you think Jesus lied to him? That was his question for the post for the Bible study. And the crazy thing is this was accepted premise. The premise was, well, we all know he lied to him. So now that we all agree with that, why? And I thought, I mean, this again was way before I was doing any of this sort of law stuff that I'm doing now. My point is that like that one, for understandable reasons, burned in my memory. I thought, okay, yeah, you kind of, there are some readings that you'd have to conclude that. You'd have to conclude that way if you've got these other presuppositions. And so this is where I think like people can read this book and think, oh, that's academic. You're doing an academic enterprise exercise. Good for you. I really do think that the way people talk about the law just shapes a lot of your reading of lots of different texts. And of course, downstream of that is your big sort of historical theology type stuff. And I just think it's not an insignificant sort of question that can have sort of big downstream effects. Yeah.
No, and I think it's fair to say that if your presuppositions have led you to the conclusion that Jesus broke one of the 10 commandments, it is probably your presuppositions that should be questioned,
If
right?
your
Like not
presuppositions led to
Jesus.
this, what good were the presuppositions? Yes. Yeah, for sure.
No, that's great. And no, I appreciate that example. Very much like what I want to do here is be able to help be a bridge between the academy and those interested kind of on the ground who want to, grapple with some deeper questions on theology.
Yeah.
And so to have people like you come on and bring that here, it's a blessing. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, glad to.
So you do, walk through, and we don't have to go through them in detail. Some common misunderstandings of Jesus' relationship with the law and the law itself. You go through three: legalism, which we've touched on already, exclusivism, and nationalism. So how do those things create difficulties? Like with the exclusivist view, right? This idea that there's Jews and there's non-Jews, and the ne'er, but should the two meet? What kind of issues do you see that pop up? I actually had a conversation today with somebody. I was like, no, I actually think the view that you're espousing right now is exclusivism, and let me tell you why I don't think that works.
Let me direct you to page 47.
Exactly.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, good question. You have a 6-year-old, 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. Is that right, Brian?
Yep.
Yep. I've got a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old. We do a lot of Play-Doh in our house,
Mhm.
and we have those cranks, right? You can crank something through, right? Crank it through, put all the Play-Doh in there you want. But, right, they have those Play-Doh cookie cutter shapes, right?
Mhm.
So you pick that star shape or that heart shape or that square, whatever, doesn't matter. Whatever shape you pick, it doesn't matter how much Play-Doh you put through. It doesn't matter what color the Play-Doh is. It doesn't matter if you've mix-maxed all the different colors there are. You crank it through that shape, it's coming out one shape, no matter how much you put in. If you assume legalism's the issue, that's your cookie cutter shape.
Mm.
No matter what text you put in there, you crank it out, result's going to be legalism.
Mhm.
So Jesus is talking with the Pharisees in Matthew 12. Pharisees are actually talking to him and his disciples. They say, "Hey, you and your disciples, your disciples are plucking grain on the Sabbath,
Mhm.
and that's not lawful. What's going on? If you've already decided legalism is sort of kind of the framing issue, well, crank that Plato through. Big surprise. This controversy is about legalism." And so then you have Jesus. Then you have a characterization of Pharisees as, of course, legalistic, and they're being too, which are then is never never a compliment, right? Legalism is always, it's one of those things that's rarely defined but never good, right? So it's never like a compliment, like, you looked really legalistic today, you look great. It's like it's always an insult, right? And so if you've got that, then well, Pharisees are legalistic. Then you've got to make Jesus the opposite of that, right? So then that means, well, he's defending their actions because they're being too legalistic, and you guys got to relax, right? That's one thing. But if you've decided the issue is nationalism, and in which nationalism in terms of like Jewish nationalism, and you think that, okay, the law was given to Israel alone, and the law marks out Israel as Israel, but Israel became too nationalistic and zealous
Mhm.
in the late Second Temple period, and the doing of the law really marked out this zealous, belonging to the law. Then the law itself, and even just keeping the law, could sort of could reinforce that Jewish nationalism. That's actually not good because it leads to zealous, action
Mhm.
against Rome. So if that's the issue, if that's the shape, now I'm at crank Matthew 12 through that. Well, Pharisees are sticklers about Sabbath, not because they're legalists, but because they're Jewish
Nationalists.
nationalists, right?
Yeah.
Who are like, hey, the law marks us out as Jews. And so, like, this is a boundary marker that's super important to us. And so if you're not on board with it, you must not be on board with us. And Jesus, and then on this view, Jesus is saying, yeah, you're right. I'm not on board with Jewish nationalism. I'm instead doing something else because the nation ought not be distinct like this anymore. And also, your nationalism is leading you to violence. So therefore, I'm just not going to do the law at all because apparently it leads to violence. Like all of a sudden, then you've got like same deal, right? It's just you've that's the framework, so it's been cranked out that way. And then same, of course, the other one, the
Yeah.
compassionless exclusivism. It becomes a contest between Jesus' mercy and their compassion, or sorry, Jesus' mercy and their lack of mercy or compassion. And so I think that those frameworks, and then put those frameworks, those cookie cutter shapes, Plato shapes, on any controversy. And I think I haven't tested it every single one, but it kind of works out in a lot of them, right? Where whatever you crank out, that of course every controversy looks like legalism when you assume that the problem is that the Pharisees are legalistic and Jesus isn't, right?
Yeah.
Or of course every controversy looks like a battle of universalism versus nationalism
Mm.
because you've already assumed that's the framework here. And so, and to be fair, these readers, particularly, I should say Tom Wright, I shouldn't say assume. He does work to show that, like, he doesn't just assume that he sort of shows his work as to why he's come to that conviction. I don't agree with that conviction, that supposition. I don't think that Jesus is combating Jewish nationalism, but it's not sort of just like a reflexive assumption on his part. But I disagree with those frameworks. I don't think they actually best capture the nature of what his opponents or sort of his conversation partners are assuming, nor does it accurately capture what Jesus is actually where the fault lines are in between them. So that when Jesus does disagree with his contemporaries about a given interpretation of the law, whether it's Sabbath, dietary laws, whatever else, or not dietary laws, ritual purity laws, whatever it is, the fault lines aren't those things, legalism, etc. There's something else, which then, of course, the burden of the book is to show, like, okay, here's that other thing, right?
Yeah, and so you do provide, you're not just trying to knock down walls, right? You do provide a framework through which to attempt to approach Christ and his interpretation of the law, and that's the framework of restoration eschatology. Right?
Yeah.
So, maybe give us kind of a short rundown of what is that view, what's the background, what is it, what's the context that's trying to set or create for us as we approach Jesus and these legal controversies.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That's a good question. Three things I'd say. One is that I'll just start with restoration eschatology, and then the three things I'd say is what's it addressing? The first is that it restoration eschatology, as sort of a label, describes a pattern of reading of Israel's scriptures and of one's place within it. So I'll kind of say that again. Restoration eschatology is a label for a pattern of reading of Israel's scriptures and one's place in it. It assumes a handful of premises, particularly premises that are supplied by the texts of Deuteronomy 28 to 30 and Leviticus 26, in which Israel received the law, was warned, hey, if you break it, violate the covenant, you're going to experience these punitive curses. And those curses are, exile, destruction of the temple, captivity to the nations, whatever. But that once you've violated the law and experienced that punitive discipline, then if you return to God, then God will restore you. So that's where the word restoration comes in here. I did not create this label. This is I first heard it from E.P. Sanders. I don't know where he got it, but E.P. Sanders is the first monograph that I read that used it. I'm sure he got it from somewhere else, but it's the idea that, like, after Israel experiences all this punitive discipline, God will restore them, and that's labeled in Deuteronomy 30 and the end of Leviticus 26, where they're going to return to God, and He's going to bring them back to the land, return to them, make everything good again, deliver them from their captivity to their enemies, but also He'll circumcise their heart, transform their heart, so that they can, actually follow God and keep His commandments, love the Lord their God with their whole heart, right? So my point in then making making this framework work, as it were, in the Gospels is, A, of course, I hope I'm not trying to just make it work. I spend a good amount of time trying to show that, like, hey, this framework's pretty widely operative, not only in the Bible, but in Second Temple Jewish literature of the period, and pretty explicitly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that as such, it provides the framework in which they depict Jesus as the herald of this restoration, and not just the herald of it in the way that John is, but actually the executor of it, in a way that's distinct from John. The reason that's then important is because it does a few things. One of which is it provides an actual framework that I think arises from the text, that's distinct from the other isms that Jesus might be opposing. In other words, some have said, oh, well, he's opposing legalism. Some have said, oh, he's opposing whatever, Jewish nationalism or compassionless exclusivism. The problem with those is that, putting it that way, frames Jesus' critique in terms of just a pattern of religion. Hey, you guys are doing it this way. You guys are doing Judaism wrong, right? You guys are doing Judaism legalistically. Instead, you need to do it this way. You guys are doing Judaism, exclusively, but we need to be more inclusive, right? You guys are doing it compassionately, and you ought to be merciful. Those kinds of patterns have the effect, not always the intention, because actually Tom Wright has the nationalism one, but he's not doing a pattern of religions approach. He's doing a restoration eschatology approach as well. But they can have the effect of distinguishing Jesus from his contemporaries in terms of a pattern of religion. In other words, you're doing the law just wrong, or you're doing our religion wrong. Whereas if you've got the restoration eschatology thing, it's not a pattern of religion distinction. It's a pre-existing plight that other Jews also regard as operative, to which he's presented as the divinely offered solution, the herald of the restoration itself and the executor of it. So that when he's announcing repent, etc., he's not saying repent of legalism or repent of whatever. He's saying, like, hey, repent. Now's the time, right? That God promised he'd rescue us. It's here now. So get on board, like, right? Which then helps, once you get to his distinction with his contemporaries. It helps show that I think his distinction is not between himself over against those other isms, legalism, etc., but transgression. Like the whole the thing that got them in the mess in the first place was their transgression of the law. Like that's how they got into the covenant plights, was their transgression of the law historically, and that it just the fact of transgression is, of course, going to be out there just by the virtue of human hearts. And so he's saying, all right, look, now's the time for repentance to turn back. And if you don't repent, then of course you're from the perspective of the Gospels, from the perspective of Jesus, you're not listening to the divinely sent Son of God, prophet, etc. So that's its own kind of transgression. But also, you're not listening to the guy who's been sent, who has the authoritative interpretation of the law, and so you might end up transgressing the Torah because you just might not be interpreting it wrong in its basic, sense. And so I think that's where you've got different kinds of passages in the Gospels where sometimes he's dialoguing with the Pharisees because they just have a different interpretation of Torah, and he thinks they're wrong about it. Over against other times where the disagreement lies on or revolves around, right? Like, hey, I'm the guy that God has sent, and y'all don't recognize that, right? And y'all should. And if you don't, that's not good.
So this is helpful. I think one of the areas in the book, as as you go into the restoration of eschatology, is I think maybe getting an understanding of just how deep that plight was for Israel. Like how stuck in a punitive cycle were they, and how much were they self-conscious of that?
Yeah, really good question. The self-conscious aspect is the one well, at one level, it's the one you can't answer, and at the other level, it's the one you could. You can't answer it in terms of self-consciousness. You can answer it in terms of, look, did every Jew think so? I don't know. Do we have lots of texts from the Second Temple period that all basically think, yeah, you guys were like, we're still in it. Like we're still experiencing this stuff. Yeah, we have a lot of these texts. And so in terms of like sort of like a national self-consciousness, I think is widespread.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, you've got, let's just take Damascus document. Damascus document, whenever you date it, let's date it BC, right? BC was 2nd century, 1st century BC, whatever. Like, they position themselves as the people who have finally returned, to, so the Damascus document is a document written by the Qumran community.
Mhm.
So whatever group's out there, whether it's the Essenes or whoever it is, that is a group responsible for the composition of this document, out in the wilderness, and they position themselves as the community who has finally returned to the law of Moses according to all that he was written, and that they're doing that during the time of God's wrath against broader Israel. This is and they're to use your words, self-consciously using the language of Deuteronomy 28:30, Leviticus 26 to describe their community as the people who are returning and everyone else as the people who are still experiencing God's wrath because they haven't returned, right? And this is hundreds of years after Judah's return to the
Yeah.
land post Babylonian exile. This is hundreds of years after. In fact, they even say they date it. They say 390 years after the Babylonian exile, right? Like they know it's much later. They know that the restoration did not obtain with Judah's return to the land. Right? But even let's fast forward. Let's fast forward to Josephus and Philo. Josephus says, I think it's Antiquities 4. I'll forget the reference. It's in the book, but he says, like, look, Moses predicted all the stuff that would happen to us. Some of which have happened, some of which is still happening today. Same with another Qumran document that puts it that way in 4Q MMT. Philo says it. Philo writing in this text probably in the mid 50s in On Rewards and Punishments says that, like, look, one day all these Israelites who are scattered, they'll hear this divine whistle and they'll return. And he has like a basic. It's kind of surprising because of how much, when you read Philo, how much sort of like allegorical exposition he has. He has a pretty non-allegorical exposition of the return of the people to the land. And it's like he can always allegorize anything, but he takes it kind of straightforwardly. Like he has a pretty straightforward, non-allegorical restoration eschatology in his text on rewards and punishment. And then lots of other texts that I also survey. I think it's pretty widespread. Like, look, we recognize the restoration didn't happen. We recognize the restoration is on the horizon somewhere down the line. We don't know when it's going to happen or who's going to bring it. And actually, importantly for the book, we don't even know everything we're supposed to do. Do we sort of bring it by returning, or do we like wait for the guy and then we return, or what? How do we? It was actually almost the subtitle of the book is "How Should We Return?" Because it's the question of like, look, we all agree with like premise one, restoration's on the horizon, but how do we do that? How do we know we're going to participate? And so my point is to say, like, Jesus is presented as by the gospel author, Jesus is presented as the one with the authoritative answer to that question. So I mean, yeah, no, does every Jew think this? I don't know.
Sure.
But you got a lot of Jewish texts from a lot of major authors that are widely read who think, yeah, this is the state we're in,
Yeah, and I think that I'm hesitant to say this here. I think that one of the things I guess I would say I kind of walked away with is, I could see people not liking this, almost a sympathy for the Pharisees in some way, right? Like that, I can try to cast them in the best light possible as saying,
right.
I think they really, many of them were probably genuinely trying to do the best they could with what they had to do what they could to help bring about that restoration. Um, and
Yeah. So
that's a lot of what causes a lot of the conflict with them in Jesus.
yeah. So exactly. So a big part of the book is to show that, like, look, I'm both as an author who knows that the Gospels are presenting Jesus as the hero. So even if I were just pure biblical studies, not a Christian or anything, like, it's very clear that the Gospels are presenting Jesus as the hero, right? And so it's very clear that the Gospels have this sort of bias toward Jesus's legal reasoning and everything else, over against the Pharisees. Also, though, as a Christian, obviously I agree with Jesus's interpretation over against the Pharisees.
Yes.
My point is to say that even taking all that for granted, one of my goals was to say that, okay, but the Pharisees, like they're not dumb. Like,
Mhm.
they have legal opinions that they didn't create to be mean, right? Like, they weren't like, let's figure out how to come up with the cruelest interpretation, right? They had legal opinions, and they came to them. I've got to assume they came by them honestly, you know. Jesus thinks some of them are mistaken. And famously, of course, not all of them, but just some of them. And so my part of my goal was to position, and to try to describe their outlook, and of course, yes, their legal opinions, as honestly and as as charitably as I could, so that actually, when you do get Jesus's disagreement with them, right? It, it's 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 not a straw man. That he's not just sort of tearing down something that are like, okay, well, like the Pharisees wouldn't even say it that way, you know. Um, so I'm trying to show that, like, because once you have, like, that's the deal. Once you, if you mischaracterize the Pharisees, then you're going to end up mischaracterizing Jesus, because you've assumed that he's critiquing some aspect that he may not actually be critiquing. Actually, goes back to the Plato thing, right? If you've assumed that, right, their issue is legalism, whatever, well, then that's just going to be how you interpret this stuff. So unless you can actually accurately represent the position that the Pharisees may well have held, then you're actually, I don't think you're actually going to accurately describe Jesus' own position and disagreement with them. So yep.
Yeah, and I think that you said something interesting on. I'll get you here on page 167, but so much of this really ultimately is going to boil down to, you know, who is Jesus, right?
Right.
As that author, you know, the authoritative interpreter. Um, but you said the legitimacy of Jesus's legal arguments depends on the truthfulness of his claim to be the commissioned Son of Man who proclaimed God's kingdom. If he is truly authorized by God, then his legal practice is acceptable, given the overriding import of his mission. However, if he is an impostor, acting not on God's authority but on his own, then he is transgressing, and worse, is leading others to transgress. So, I mean, that caused me to kind of put myself in the shoes of a Pharisee for a second and think
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
position's terrible,
Yeah.
right? Because you're trying to do good, but like, if this guy is who he says he is, awesome. If not, awful.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So thanks for bringing this up, because it's like, it really is kind of the beating heart of the book, and it comes out of the exposition of Matthew 12, because there I give a really, in my view, at least, obviously, of course I would say this, but important distinction between two different kinds of interpretation, right? Or two different kinds of controversies, or
Mhm.
really three, but really two main ones. Um, right. There, sometimes Jesus and the Pharisees will disagree and they'll hash it out, and then that's it. Nothing happens. And then sometimes, like, they'll clash, and the Pharisees will leave and be like, "Oh, we got to kill this guy," or they'll suddenly be like, "Whoa, who are you? Who do you say that you are?" Like, that's what it leads to, right? By
Mhm.
what authority do you? And so I wanted to be able to account for the difference. In fact, actually, it was it was it was Sanders and Chris Keith's arguments, decades apart, that were like, look, just standard disagreements between different legal authorities don't lead to them wanting to kill each other.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, the Mishnah itself records super heated debates between between different kinds of Pharisees, not even just between different kinds of Jews, like different kinds of Pharisees. It's just super heated and they get intense, but they're like they didn't think the other person was leading the other nation astray and they thought they ought to be executed. So it's like, what accounts for this? Or I mean, are they just like painting the wildest picture to just make it an interesting story or to make the Pharisees look out to be terrible or what? I thought, no, there's got to be something more fundamental here. And so what I think that I described this, and I think I described it accurately, is there are different kinds of legal controversies. One of which is what I call it non-eschatological nomism,
Mhm.
where it's just sort of standard like nomistic legal disputes. Like the Pharisees have an opinion on XYZ. It's different than Jesus' opinion. And Jesus' opinion doesn't hinge upon sort of his eschatological identity. In other words, for example, Mark 7 is a great example where they're like, hey, Jesus, why don't your disciples wash their hands? And then he gives them the answer about the process of digestion and defecation, purifying the foods. And that's why his disciples don't need to wash their hands because it won't end up defiling the person. Nothing within that argument depends upon Jesus'
Mm.
identity as the Son of Man. It's just sort of like it's his legal reasoning about the directionality of ritual impurity. It's an argument about ritual impurity. That's it. Nothing else. It does not depend upon his identity
Yep.
of him being the Son of Man.
And you mentioned he does the same thing in one of his healing episodes.
Yeah, Luke
where he's
14,
questioned
when
on
he
that.
heals the guy with dropsy. When he heals the guy with dropsy, the guy with edema or excessive fluid in his body, they're like, he's like, look, who of you wouldn't draw a guy out of the well? If you had a sheep or a son fall into a well, who of you wouldn't draw it out? He says, right. He asked the question in such a way that he expects a positive answer, like, yeah, we would do that. And so then he just seems to be reasoning from lesser to greater, like, look, if you would help a sheep or an ox or an animal, or your own son to escape them from their watery condition, why are you objecting that I'm helping this guy escape his watery condition, edema, dropsyism, excessive fluid in the body? It's just a legal argument based on what I argue in the book is his legal reading of the Sabbath legislation. It doesn't depend upon his identity as this divinely commissioned figure, right? But all of a sudden, then you've got other passages
Mhm.
where his argument does. One of the premises in the argument is, I'm commissioned. I'm commissioned to act this way. If I don't fulfill my commission, then I'm transgressing, the divine will for my life. And this commissioning is so important. It's so urgent. It's so, significant that it overrides or
Yeah.
temporarily suspends the doing of other commandments that might conflict with it so that I can keep my commission duty. Now, that's a legal argument that Pharisees or other interlocutors would totally agree with.
Mhm.
Like, they all agree. They all understand the premise that, yeah, okay, we're all supposed to circumcise. We're all supposed to keep Sabbath. We're all supposed to do whatever. But all of a sudden, when there's an alternative duty
Yep.
that is more important or more significant, or whether that duty is just that could suddenly fall upon any of us, like to save a life, or whether it's, for example, the priests who are supposed to be offering sacrifices and that's their commission duty. Once those ingredients are dropped into the legal question, then it's not simply a question of, well, do I keep this law or don't I? It's not, it's like, oh no, which one do I keep? What do I
Yeah.
do here? And they all recognize that the more urgent thing causes the other commandment to be subordinated and temporarily not kept. And this is my point about, like, look, the Sabbath episode of Matthew 12 with the grain fields, right? Like his argument depends upon so that the Pharisees come to Jesus' disciples and say, like, hey, why are your disciples doing what's not lawful? Because they're plucking grain on the Sabbath. And Jesus ends up defending their action, not by saying, hey, you guys are legalistic and you don't understand. Y'all are being too strict and you got to loosen up, right? Instead, he says, like, look, hey, the priests who are in the temple, they work on the Sabbath. They profane the
Mhm.
Sabbath, but they're innocent. that claim is a claim that hey, the priests profane the Sabbath. But to do what? Why are they profaning the Sabbath? It's because they're doing their commissioned work of sacrificing. And if they're doing their commissioned work of sacrificing, that has to be superordinated to all other commandments.
Well, and I
And
thought you
so, yeah, right. And so, like this, so he used that as an analogy for himself and his disciples. Look, we're doing our commissioned work. So, if keeping the Sabbath ever conflicts with it, then we have the authority to temporarily suspend Sabbath to keep our commissioned duty. So, I think the Pharisees, the point is to answer your question, Pharisees agree with that legal argument, but the premise that they wouldn't accept or that they have to verify is okay, but are you commissioned or not?
right,
And then
and
that
so
becomes the issue. Yeah.
yeah, and I thought you gave a good example of that of running a red light,
Right.
right? Like if I go out and I just run a red light,
Yeah.
then yeah, that's illegal. I broke the law.
Right.
If a cop runs a red light, sirens blaring in pursuit of somebody,
Yeah.
now, yeah, I mean, there's technically a law broken, but that gets overridden based on
Yeah.
his authority and commission. Now, if I am in a false police car with false
Mhm.
lights and I run the red light, well, then I'm faking authority, and now this is a
Yep.
problem,
Yep. Exactly. And you have
right?
to prove it. That's the deal. So in other words, the example I prove is right, or the example I offer is okay. Priests like in the argument when he says, okay, priests profane the Sabbath and are innocent, right? The the priest has an advantage here. Everyone knows they're a priest. Everyone knows they're a priest. Everyone can point to a scriptural text that says, okay, but the scriptural text says that they're supposed to offer on the Sabbath. And so, like, come on, they got the green light here. Actually, yeah, pun intended. They got, they got, they have the override here, right? Like, Jesus doesn't have that.
Yeah,
He's claiming that authority, but he doesn't have a publicly attested
sure.
sort of proof of identity. Like he can just whip out his ID that says, "Well, I'm the Son of God." Right? See, it says right here, right? He has to. In other words, actually, that's precisely what his miracles and everything else are. They're the validations of his authorization. And so in other words, to go back to the example that you brought up that I do bring up in the book is the point about an ambulance, right? Just like the priest gets this override, but the priest has the advantage of a publicly recognized office. They have a uniform. They have scriptural texts that back them up, right? Same with an ambulance. An ambulance doesn't, but the ambulance has the advantage of being a car that everyone recognizes. It's got the sirens, it's got the word ambulance written all over it, right? And it's got written laws protecting it. If you're just a civilian who runs the light, you might actually have a good reason, right?
Yeah.
Like if you like if I'm got a phone call that like, hey, my whatever, some crime, deadly
Mhm.
crime happened in my house. I'm racing to my house.
Yep.
I get pulled over by a red light. I probably wouldn't even stop. I would just keep going to my house until that cop caught up with me. If the cop did like actually stop me, I'd be like, dude, I'm going. I've got to. You're not stopping me. Give me an escort. But like if that happens, like I have to be able to prove it.
Yeah.
Like I can't just assert it. And the cop would agree, might potentially agree with my reasoning. Oh, okay, yeah, that would be a reason. Like, that would be a reason to get to the emergency. That would be a reason to run that red light or whatever to be going the speed limit. But you got to be able to prove it. You can't just assert that. And that's the position that Jesus is in. He's making a legal argument that is true if you grant the premise, or sorry, it's true irrespective, but logically, but it's only sort of really true, right? Valid or whatever. If he's if the premise that he's authorized is true. So then he's gotta verify that. How do you verify that? Well, he presents his offer, he presents his miracles and everything else as verifications of that. That's actually where the interchange between John's disciples and Jesus becomes so important for me. Right? John is in prison, sends his disciples to Jesus, says, Are you the one to come? Or should we expect someone else? In other words, the question isn't just, right, is restoration coming? The question is, are you the guy? He says, well, go tell John what you see. The dead are raised, blind see, etc. So he's presenting his healings as evidence that, yeah, I'm the guy. Um, and that's when that Matthew 12 scene, right after he gives that defense about the grain field episode, Matthew 12, where where his legal defense depends upon his identity claim. It's after that that he then performs an exorcism, and the crowd say, "Oh, could this be the son of David?" And the Pharisees say, "Oh, he's not the son of David. Like he's doing these exorcisms by the power of da, 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 Beelzebub or whatever." Um, in other words, they see that he's acting with authority. Then it becomes a question of by what authority are you doing it? If you're
Yeah.
doing it by divine authority, well, then yeah, you're the guy, right? But if you're not, then you're in league, right? And yeah,
And so I think you do a pretty good job here of establishing that Jesus is not anti-law, right? He is not antinomian, but that he is acting as the divinely authorized interpreter of the law, such that this, and correct me if I'm missing you here, such that this is how the people of God should live in the restoration. Is that
yep, yeah. I mean, yeah, sure, yes, yeah. On the whole, there's obviously a bunch of nuances that will come in with the Book of Acts, yeah,
sure? Yeah.
but yeah,
And so, and maybe this would be a good time to pivot to, you do what struck me as in my read, and we've chatted about this already, a particularly interesting view on the cross,
okay, yeah,
and the place of the cross and sacrifice. And so, um, I do want to give you some time to nuance that, because I think in my talking with you already, I see a slightly different view than what I took away from reading you on your view
mm,
that
mm,
um, the cross is not a sacrifice in and of itself. Is that a fair
mhm,
way to say it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So what I say in the book is that one of the things. So obviously, you're right. You've got Jesus. He's rejected by his kinsmen. He's still trying to. He's been heralding this restoration. He sees that they are not accepting it, and so, but he's still determined to restore them, and so he's going to give himself as a ransom to pay the redemption price to get them out of the captivity. In other words, to effect the restoration that he's been heralding. Now, within that, I make a point that I think it's significant to. I think the language I use in the book is to unhitch Jesus's death from sacrifice. And what I mean by that is to say that I think it's a mistake in the synoptic gospels to reduce his crucifixion to a sacrifice in the technical sense of sacrifice. The trouble with a sentence like that is that hearers are used to coupling sacrifice, right, with Jesus's death,
Mhm.
but also in particularly, even if even when we don't have technical definitions of sacrifice at work, our working definition of sacrifice is when something is sort of self-given, giving of the self, right? So when someone is expending a lot of their own time and energy, you might say that that's sacrificial, right? And so we have a cultural lexicon, cultural encyclopedia, in fact, in which sacrifice is associated with selflessness.
Mhm.
Right? Obviously, I think Jesus is being sort of uh, self-giving here, so I'm not denying that. My point is actually to do two things. One, to give sacrifice a very technical and sort of strict definition, and then to say that it doesn't appear that the synoptic gospels employ that kind of definition and or association with his crucifixion reductively.
Mhm.
What I mean is that his death is really actually quite importantly for hearers to understand that his death is salvific, his death is effectual, but I don't think sacrifice is the appropriate metaphorical domain to interpret it.
Okay. And I've got a quote from you on 208 that I think would maybe help with that a little bit. You said his death is liberative or liberative in that his death his death pays the punitive debt held and exercised by Israel's captors, thereby liberating those held due to this debt. So, though his death is not strictly a sacrifice, it is nonetheless salvific. So, would that hinge on that statement of it not being strictly a sacrifice?
Yeah. So here's what I mean with that. So some people are like, okay, it sounds like I'm hedging. Here's my point. A sacrifice, in the way I'm describing it, is something that is it's an object that is transferred from common space to sacred space. So it's given from just a lay space into sacred space, such that it now becomes sacred property. In other words, there's a directionality to it, that it goes from common to sacred space. It is handled and officiated by sacred officiants, designated sacred officiants, obviously priests. Oftentimes, the sacrifice, or all the time rather, the sacrifice is not reducible to the thing's slaughter. So you could slaughter an animal, right? But that's not the sacrifice. The sacrifice is actually the presentation of the thing to the sacred space, or obviously to God, who is in the sacred. Also, it that may be all of it. It's there may be more there, but that's sort of the basic idea, right? It's transferred from
consummation and eating the sacrifice tends to
yeah,
in as part of this,
consummation
right?
and eating it, and of course the burning of it after the effect. Now, some of that will have come from David Moffat's work. He's done work on. He's got an essay called I think it's called "The Directionality of Sacrifice," and of course a lot of his work on Hebrews that I've learned a lot from. My point is that in the Gospels, right, you got none of that. Right, he's not presented to God in sacred space. He's executed on a cross. It's not. He's not presented sort of unblemished and whole. He's thoroughly blemished by his torture and everything else. He's not officiated by sort of sacred officiants, right? And his cross is sort of the moment of his death. It's whereas in sacrifice, the death of the animal is the first process among many steps, and is possibly the least important, because it can be done by a non-sacred officiant, whereas everything else has to be done by a sacred officiant. Now, of course, someone could hear that and be like, okay, sure, it's not a literal sacrifice in the technical sense, but it still could be functioning metaphorically as a sacrifice. And here's why I think that doesn't work. One is because, and this is kind of the real important thing, sacrifice doesn't get you out of the broken covenant. Once the covenant is broken, sacrifice is ineffectual to repair the covenant. That's kind of really the main literary and theological, and actually just literary. I mean, as a matter of exegesis, reason I don't describe Jesus' death reductively, or strictly rather, as an atoning sacrifice. Sacrifices do not get you out of a broken covenant. Not only do they not get you out of it, and the text I lean on quite a bit is Leviticus 26:31, which says, "Look, once you've broken this covenant, I will cease smelling your soothing aromas." In other words, sacrifice is something that not only does it not repair the covenant, God disregards it. He does not regard it. So that's one thing. Sacrifice in and of itself cannot mend the broken covenant. Not only do I think that's accurate from Leviticus and Deuteronomy, I think it's accurate in the prophets. I can't think of a prophet. I know that people will go to Isaiah 53, but I have a long footnote on Isaiah 53 on why I think that Isaiah 53 does not present the figure as a sacrifice. Again, leaning heavily on Moffat and an essay by Janowski. the point there is that I can't think of a prophetic text that depicts the restoration as a product of a sacrifice being given. Now,
Mhm.
get to the Gospels. If sacrifice can't repair the covenant, if all these prophets who are talking about restoration don't depict restoration as a product of some sort of sacrifice, then that alone is kind of enough evidence for me to think, okay, well, then I don't think the Gospels are presenting Jesus as a sacrifice, because that wouldn't get them out of the mess that they're in, right?
Mhm.
Now, on top of it, really importantly, and then I'll pause for your question.
Yeah.
On top of it, even if we were to assume that, okay, yeah, sacrifice works, and it works fine, and they're just using that, they're just it's a metaphorical thing that they're applying to Jesus because sacrifice is this positive imagery that we're trying to associate with Jesus. Then I'd have a different set of problems, because in the priestly literature, you cannot give a sacrifice for the guilt of bloodshed. There are sacrifices for unintentional sin. There are sacrifices for certain kinds of intentional sin, like some of in Leviticus 5, but not bloodshed. And then, of course, in Leviticus 16, you get the sacrifices for the Day of Atonement that potentially, are this sort of grand big reset button. But and so but even if you thought Leviticus 16 atoned for sort of everything, even then, all it's done is cleanse the sanctuary. Like, it has the effect of cleansing the sanctuary. There is no sacrifice for land cleansing. There's no
Mhm.
sacrifice that cleanse the land, and murder, bloodshed, defiles the land. In other words, if you're guilty of bloodshed or murder, that defiles the land. Yom Kippur doesn't take care of that. Other sacrifices don't take care of that. And God explicitly says, I don't accept sacrifice for that. And then that, of course, then becomes, not only is that in Numbers, but it's retrieved that way in some Second Temple literature, like Jubilee says it that way. Like, look, there's no sacrifice for this. If you try to give sacrifice to get you out of the guilt of murder, then you've actually basically given a bribe. Um, and so my point then is to make that work where I see that at work in the Gospels is when Jesus, right, indicts his kinsmen of bloodshed and says, like, look, this is what y'all are guilty of. Y'all because y'all are killing me, the son that God sent. Like, you're um you're becoming guilty of, right, all the righteous blood that has been shed since Abel to Zechariah, right, and
Yeah.
all the prophets. And so he indicts them for bloodshed. There's no sacrifice for that. So my point is that literarily and theologically, if you reduced Jesus' death to have the same effect as, metaphorically, an atoning sacrifice, you would limit its effect.
And I think we had chatted about this earlier, that I can see the point that you're driving there, especially as you're bringing out the Old Testament text about there not being a sacrifice for that, but that some debt has to be paid, right?
Mhm.
That it wouldn't strictly be sacrifice.
Yeah, because debt payment
Eh,
isn't a sacrifice. Yep.
right. And so I
It's
see the
financial
distinction
debt.
that you're making there. And we chatted about this earlier, but I could also see kind of a both and category for the cross as sacrifice in an initiatory sacrifice of the new covenant, because this
Yeah.
new covenant is being cut. And it is, that's very common in the Old Testament. When a covenant is being cut or initiated, sacrifice happens there.
Mhm.
And so this was pretty much like the one spot in the book where I was like, I need some more thought on where you're at there. And I'd
Yeah,
love to have somebody else chime in on
for
that who's way
sure.
smarter than me,
Yeah.
um,
Well, and I totally get that, and that's legitimate. And I think I have a spot in there where I say something to that effect, in the sense of, like, look, it is associated with Passover because Passover is this
mhm.
initiatory moment.
Sure.
My
In
point is
Christ,
to
right?
say
The
that it's not
Paschal
an
lamb, and
atoning sacrifice, right? Yeah, and of course, yeah, that's the point.
yeah,
I however careful I was, I don't know. I was quite careful to say that this is just what I think is going on in the synoptics. I'm not making a claim that this is how every New Testament text speaks.
sure.
And so if you were to take the whole New Testament witness, and I'm obviously would bring sacrificial language to different elements from both death to ascension. My point though in the Gospels is that I try to distinguish between initiatory, sort of covenant ratifying sacrifice and atoning sacrifice.
Okay.
And that's where I say, like, look, it's not an atoning sacrifice, because an atoning sacrifice is something that initiatory sacrifices that are covenant ratifying aren't atoning typically, as far as I know. I don't think they are in Exodus 24. Um, and also, they're they're my real point is to get at, like, when people say, like, look, okay, well, whatever I see going on in Leviticus 4 with the sin offering must is metaphorically what I should apply to what's going on here.
Mhm.
That's what I regard as the mistake. Um, and it's a bilateral mistake. It's a mistake because Leviticus 4, right, is for unintentional sin, and so it wouldn't then actually, if you applied that logic to Jesus' stuff, then it wouldn't actually cover other sins. And then also, again, same thing I already mentioned about bloodshed, etc. That there's actually no atoning sacrifice for that. Then also, it's a two-way street, right? If you assume that Jesus' death is a sacrifice, then I'd be worried that people look at the cross and retrospect that backward into animal sacrifice. Like, well,
Right.
all right, the cross is this moment where Jesus is really getting very badly treated, you know, and that sacrifice for you. So that must be what's going on in Leviticus 4, right? And that'd be the direction toward that'd be the mistake. I think that's operative at your reading of
Reading
Leviticus.
backwards.
I don't think that they're
Yeah.
right, like, trying to mistreat this animal for the sake of some sort of substitutionary effect or something.
So maybe let's jump to one more topic, before we land the plane here, and take a look a little bit in Acts, right? So you presented Jesus as the authoritative interpreter of the law. He's not here to make the law completely go away. And so the early Christians have to kind of flesh out, now, what does this look like, right? I
Yeah,
mean, we've
right.
got Gentiles now flooding into the church. Jesus was interpreting the law of Israel. How then shall we live? Right?
Yeah.
Like how are we doing all of this? So
Uh-huh.
what do you see happening there in Acts 15? I thought this was an interesting take.
Good. Well, thank you. Again, if you don't like this take, you can blame Richard Bauckham. I, I have a couple of extra insights into it, I think, but not many. I mean, I think it's largely something I learned from him. Yeah, the take there is that, obviously Acts 15, Apostolic Jerusalem Council, got this influx of the Gentiles, and God love them, but we just don't know what to do with them, right? Like, what do they do now, right? So you got some Pharisees who are like, well, they need to get circumcised and direct them to keep all the law of Moses. They have the debate. It's not the conclusion that the apostles reach. They say instead, no. They quote this amalgamation of prophetic texts in which I think they highlight, in my opinion, the fact that they are included as nations.
Mhm.
That look, God's always said, right, that He'd rebuild the fallen booth of David and restore us, and then all of mankind would seek Him, and all the nations would come in. So it seems that they are quoting texts that highlight the influx of nations as a response to the restoration of Israel itself.
Mhm.
So that they seem to be highlighting the identity of these nations as nations.
Yeah.
In other words, they remain Gentiles.
Yeah.
Um, and then that leads to, well, what do they do from the law then? And I th- I think they decide upon requirements from Leviticus, particularly Leviticus 17 and 18, that obligate both the Israelite and the foreigner in their midst, because the law itself did not identically obligate all possible hearers. Right, the law obligates priests to some things, Israelites to some things, non-Israelites to others. And so they see that these non-Israelites are coming into the fold, and they say, okay, then, all right, well, then here's what God's law says to them. They ought to do these things from the law. that are obligatory for both us and for non-Israelites. And importantly, this is the sort of the Bauckham thing the Bauckham insight that I thought was helpful, is they don't choose every, at least on my, again, on my reading, this is, highly contested text, obviously, but on my reading, they don't select every possible law from the Old Testament that gets applied to Gentiles. They select more or less, four. Things contaminated by idols, blood, things strangled, and sexual immorality.
Yeah.
And these appear to be the order of their appearance in Leviticus 17 and 18, but also B, they seem to be texts that they seem to be laws that Leviticus 17 and 18 single out for foreigners who are, quote, in your midst.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Bauckham has argued for a catchword association. One of the quoted texts from Jeremiah 12 mentions that these nations will be built up in your midst. So that language of in your midst becomes the catchword association that helps them decide which laws from Leviticus get applied. They're the ones that also attach that phrase in your midst to them. So that's my reading of that text, where that's what I think, if I remember right, the subtitle for that section was Leviticus for Gentiles, where it's like, this is, it's straightforwardly and comfortably applying Levitical laws to believers, and seems to be assuming a different set of sort of obligations for two different parties, Jews and Gentiles. To me, I'm comfortable with that. I think others aren't. I don't agree with the discomfort, but I understand the reflex.
Mm-hmm.
I understand the instinct. Part of it is because it sounds like, well, if you have different obligations, there's inequality or something, right? And that I just don't agree with. That I just think, like, well, no, like, I mean, we're all American citizens, but people got different roles,
Sure.
whatever. Or everyone, right, who like at one level, if you're just addressing a crowd full of only Israelites, you'd be like, hey, we're all Israelites, right? But the high priest has obligations that are different than the priest. The priests have different obligations than non-priests, and then stratify it out from there. Or I shouldn't say stratify. I should say distinguish, because it's not an issue of social stratification. But it's just baked into the law itself, and so that you could still have unity. Hey, we're all Israel here. We're all God's people. We're all equally beloved, etc. And yet we've got different obligations. It seems like that is actually, of course, I would say this, but it seems to be precisely what you have in Acts 15, right? Like, hey, Jews and Gentiles, both saved on the same basis, right? Both saved by the grace of Jesus, both, in need of Christ and his work, and both going to be judged by the same guy, the Messiah. And we're all one, we're all the people of God, but here are y'all's obligations and here are ours, right? Because the laws that we have distinguish us qua Jews, qua Israelites. And you non-Jews, you don't have to keep the dietary laws, or at least not all the ones that we do.
Right.
Yeah. So that's how I shake that out.
No, like I said, I thought it was an interesting take. And I appreciated the way you were really kind of showing a harmony there with the law and, the apostles as sort of taking on an authoritative interpretive role post resurrection. I mean, am I stating that too strongly? I mean,
yeah, or that the law still continues to have an authoritative role, or did the apostles do, or both?
Both.
Yeah, I mean, the apostles are right. I mean, that's the point. They're having to meet in Jerusalem and have it hash it out, and then the conclude the phrase that's always stuck out with me is he says, the whole gosh, what did he say? That the Holy Spirit has said X, Y, Z, and that this is in agreement with the prophets. And it'll take me too long to look it up, but he says, and this is in agreement with the prophets. I thought, okay, yeah, they're not just simply saying, right, well, we did the exegesis, here's the X's and O's. But they're also saying that the opinion that they came to by virtue of discussion with one another and guidance by the Spirit is harmonious with what the prophets say, right? In fact, I actually think harmonious is probably the best word for it. Sort of like, I think it's with one voice with the prophets or something like that. So yeah, and then that the prophets themselves leads them to an exegesis of Leviticus, which is where I think is interesting.
And that's it's coming to land plane around here is one of the things that I most appreciated this book was that attempt to synthesize and create harmony between the Old and the New Testaments and Jesus working within the law in that framework.
Yeah.
And so again, do I, am I going to agree with every bit or conclusion? I mean, probably not. I mean, but I loved, and we talked about this earlier, your concluding paragraph, right? Where basically, like you mentioned, like, hey man, I'm doing my best here. And,
yeah.
And so, no, I've enjoyed it. It's given me some things to chew on, wrestle with, and kind of sit back within my own faith tradition as a Catholic. I think there's probably some hard lines there that,
Sure.
it's like, I got to stay within these boundaries, and I'm good with that.
Yeah.
But for you, where do you see, I guess maybe we'll kind of land on this. What do you see the next steps in this area of research? When it comes to restoration eschatology, like what more needs to be done to flesh this idea out?
Yeah. A couple things. Good question. And thanks for that. And actually, that was the last paragraph on purpose, because I was all too aware of the fact that I made, some claims, right? And claims upon big topics. And I, I know I'm wrong. I just don't know what I'm wrong about. I know I'm wrong about something. I can't be. I hope I'm not. Goodness, I hope I'm not wrong about everything. But I know I'm wrong about something. I just don't know what I'm wrong about. And so my point there was to say, like, look, I've learned so much from other scholars, a lot of Jewish scholars, Yer Furstenberg, Isaac Oliver, and a handful of others. But also just on top of it, just a lot of scholarship that I've learned from. But my point there was to say that, like, look, okay, this work is kind of my own personal foray, but also in academic scholarship, an early foray relative to how much time has been spent on it on other topics into Jesus's legal reasoning. And I know I'm wrong about something. I just don't know what it is yet. So, I hope this work gets improved on. And that's not just sort of like a nice conclusion so that people don't get too mad at me, right? It really, I really mean it, But I will say that then also gets toward the actual question you asked, which was, so what's next? I do have the conviction actually that so much time has been spent on, understandably, but so much time has been spent on the topic of X and the law. So Jesus and the law, the Gospels and the law, the Gospel and the law, Paul and the law, in terms of a theological systematic topic that has blinded, hindered. I don't know. There's less harsh word for it. Slowed the next question that I think people could ask, which is, okay, well, let's just assume a certain premise about the law, namely that it's not a should we, shouldn't we, but it's a we should, or here it's still authoritative in some respect, whatever you think that respect is, right? Now let's do the next step, which is delve into this author's legal reasoning. What are the kind of arguments, presuppositions, both legal and ethical, that this person makes to come to the conclusions that they come to? I think that can be revealing at a historical level. It can just be revealing in terms of, like, okay, here's Jesus's ruling on X commandment over against this other person's. At a theological level, obviously legal reasoning also intersects quite obviously with ethics. And you're gonna, like, once you are able to think with, not only once you're able to, like, sort of exegete a person's legal reasoning, you can kind of pull the curtain back a little bit on some. I think you can pull the curtain back a little bit on sort of ethical presuppositions. But also, then once you've established those, or at least some sort of plausible reading of them, you can then think with them. so that once I've like done what I've done on Matthew 12 or whatever text, right, about Jesus' legal reasoning, I'm able then to apply that reasoning toward other ethical or legal questions that might arise,
Right.
even if they're not the ones Jesus faces. Of course, that's going to be not every not all of the readership of the Gospels or my book is interested in that question, but for those who are, it's relevant to be like, okay, I'm going to think with Jesus here, or Paul, or whatever other author, right? And so that I don't have their answer to everything, but I can work with the premises and the tools that they've supplied me. And so often the premises and tools they've supplied is the examples of their engagement with Torah.
With Torah, yeah.
And I just think that's I put it this way, it's an underexplored issue in current biblical studies that I
Well,
would like to keep exploring.
I was going to say, I mean, if there's anybody listening that's looking for a topic to start diving into, yeah, there you go.
There you go. That's a free one. That's a free one. Yeah.
Awesome. Dr. Sloan, thank you so much for coming on with us. This has been a pleasure to talk about this and kind of pick your brain and see how this process came out for you. Like I said, this is a book worth wrestling with.
Yep.
I've really enjoyed it, and I hope others do too. So again, it is Jesus and the Law of Moses with Baker Academic, who they just always do awesome work. So, Dr. Sloan, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for talking.
Absolutely.